Hey everybody, I'm Peter Hamilton, and you're watching another webinar from Documentary Business. And today I'm chatting with Dan Salerno. And Dan is a veteran programming executive and senior consultant. And Dan has done a lot of really deep, original research into what the legacy networks are doing now, what kind of programs they're buying, what kind of scale. And what we've been finding out is that even in the so-called sunset of the legacy network, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of programs are still being acquired, still being commissioned. And that's the data that Dan's going to pour into today. This is the third in a series. The first one was on Nat Geo, secondly, Discovery, and today A&E. So Dan, welcome to our series of Where's the Beef in the legacy world of programming.
Hey, thanks, Peter. It's always fun. I clearly I got the dress code memo, right? At least on our color palette that we were going to go with.
You're looking good, Dan. So Dan, A&E Network, let's go to our first slide and we'll figure out what we're going to talk about today. A&E Networks, our 2026 snapshot. What are they spending on? We're going to look at the breakdown between specials and series, and of course, implied in that is theatrical documentaries. Are they still in demand? What genres are a priority for A&E? What's the spend, and what are the trends? So Dan, let's start with A&E specials versus series. What are the format breakdowns?
Yeah. Before we even jump right into that aspect, if we want to set the table just for a second and say, A&E as a whole has been around for quite some time, and throughout this discussion, Peter, we'll probably be touching constantly on A&E's sort of unique business profile relative to National Geographic and Discovery that we talked about in the last weeks, with National Geographic really being paired up internally with Disney Plus, with Discovery Channel, at least for the moment, being paired up with its HBO Max and Discovery Plus streaming services. And A&E does not have that aspect to their portfolio. So that'll influence a lot of the discussions that we have as we walk through this. But jumping right into specials versus series,
So
in
let's
some
go to the next
ways, it's
slide.
like there is no specials, or there are no specials. Let me get my grammar correct there. There is no versus. It's a series-driven network. There's a smattering of specials, as we'll walk through here in the chart that we just put up. But this is truly a series-driven network in a very sort of intentional way as a whole. But
So Dan, look, my big takeaway here is looking at the bottom line there, 2024, around about 400 hours, excuse me, 2025, nearly 400, 2026 on target, maybe even to exceed that. So there's a consistent high demand for fresh original series.
yes, there very much are, and I think two things to add to that. You're correct on 2026. I went back and um, I looked at the pattern for 25, and they added about 140 hours in the back half of the year. That'll put them right around 400. If they do the same pace, that'll put them right around 400 hours this year. So, despite what we've all talked about ourselves, as well as we've read in just about every trade and seen on every panel, A&E has kind of had a steady drumbeat of about 400 hours a year consistently. We haven't seen that nosedive that we saw even on Discovery, and to some smaller degree for National Geographic, with about a 15 or 20% drop. A&E has held really steady. They've held steady with series. We'll dig into what those series are in a bit, but they've very much held steady. The other key part that you mentioned there, Peter, is really important. Fresh original. None of this is acquisition, as best as I can tell. Maybe there's one that snuck in there that I've missed, and there wasn't a press release in a proper sense on it, so I wasn't aware of it. Anybody's be happy to hear about it if I did miss. But everything you're seeing on A&E is full-blown original content, fully commissioned for the most part. There's really not an appetite here for acquisitions or co-pros. So it's a model that has worked for them, and a model that they have utilized for as long as we can remember. They have not yet succumbed to some of the direction that we've seen a little bit with Discovery and heavily with National Geographic, where they start looking for the balance between co-production funding, acquisitions, and full commissions.
So let's look at genres and see what are the genre categories of these commissions.
Yeah, again, they're remarkably simple in their, the thing about a network quite often is, trying to figure out who you are and who you want to be for the viewer. And sometimes you want a broader remit, as you do with a number of networks out there. Maybe even, if you're outside the nonfiction base and you want a little bit of drama, a little bit of comedy, sports, news, children's. With the nonfiction networks, they're a little bit more niche, of course, in terms of the format. But subject-wise, some of them are broader. Discovery is a great example. Some of them are a little bit more, say, audience-specific, like a TLC or an Oxygen, Bravo. Some of them are genre-specific, like HGTV, Food, Animal Planet. A&E is a little closer to the genre-specific. They very much settle into two major buckets, if you will. And when we look ahead a little bit, you'll see that even more pronounced as we look at the year to year. But for the moment, the big two categories are unscripted, and then this umbrella category I have of crime and justice. Music is almost really non-existent. They had a flurry of music bios for several years. Documentary is kind of an umbrella category for me when something doesn't fit neatly into the unscripted and crime area, but still A&E does dip its toe in every now and then, and they certainly did last year. Food is almost non-existent. I think I had to create that one a few years ago because they did a couple of shows, and then I guess it must not have worked, and they disappeared them. They've got a really wonderful weekend block that they do commission original content for that we're not talking about today. But there's a really good weekend block. I think it's called Homemade that does a nice little business for them. But the genres really are unscripted and crime.
Dan, can you help me with unscripted? It seems like a very kind of generic, almost genre unspecific title.
Yeah. It's not an unusual reaction to that, and there's probably a little bit of truth. Unscripted, though, in this case with A&E specifically, really almost has two sub buckets, and maybe I'll break them out, for future tracking. But the two buckets are what I'll call the Wars franchise, Neighborhood Wars, Customer Wars. Oh my goodness, I'm blanking on the third one right out of the gate. Squatters was sort of in this category, a new series that they brought in this year. So these kind of wars, and those are lower cost, heavily user-generated footage as the base. And it's a really simple A versus B. It's in the title what it is. They crank them out. They're half-hour formats. And they crank them out in batches of 10, 20, 25 episodes in high volume. And it's one of the reasons why you see in such a great volume in A&E and this sort of steadiness in their volume is the Wars franchise is fairly economic to produce. You can roll them out really quick, and clearly they're performing. They're heavily, in this case, dominated on their Tuesday night. I'm not sure how relevant that is to this discussion, but it's a big part of it. And then the other part of the unscripted is kind of also a niche franchise. A couple of years ago, they cut a deal with WWE, and they've had about 3 or 4 different franchises that continue to dominate on Sunday nights, almost 52 weeks a year. LFG, Rivals, which is kind of a biography versus biography series, and Legends, which is a true biography. In fact, they've even labeled a lot of those biographies. Greatest Moments, which is pretty self-defining, but they've really worked heavily with WWE to create hundreds of hours, a couple hundred hours, I think, over time. That's largely what the unscripted numbers are.
Just a quick aside, it all sounds very male to me.
Yeah, it is. Although, frankly, with the demographics, very much in the unscripted, it's probably male with the wrestling. But I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I know it's a different time and place, but my Midwestern Norman Rockwell loving grandmother was one of the biggest wrestling viewers that I've ever met. So I wouldn't be surprised to see kind of a much more even male-female skew in the wrestling category. The wars category is set up really, though, very much, I think, also to be a split with, it's A versus B and very character-driven. And, keep in mind, as a generality, the female demographic really likes to lean into characters, emotions, story arcs of individuals and grab a hold of people. So with the, neighborhood wars, customer wars, sort of franchise, even storage wars falls under the unscripted place. Those are character driven, and I wouldn't be surprised to see pretty close to a 50-50 as opposed to, say, 60-40, 70-30. And then crime for sure is 50-50, if not 53-55% female. Crime is always leaned female. It's one of the greatest reasons why all the networks lean into it, including broadcast, right? It's women in at least in the traditional sense, and we're talking now probably a while back. So a lot of these the roles have sort of shifted with multi television set households and things like that. But generally speaking, it's women making the decision in the household on the purchasing, and that's where advertisers wanted to lean, and therefore you end up with CSI franchises and NCIS and Chicago, all over NBC and so forth, still to this day.
Dan, let's go on and look at the trends then. By the way, there seems to be some, maybe an accident outside my apartment here, so I'll have to go on and off the volume for sirens, etc. Anyway, so let's look at the trends, Dan.
Yeah, sure. And hey, as long as we're talking about some of these, fire rescue police shows, there's nothing wrong with a little natural sound effects there in the background. But the trends, I think, is you sort of walk through the genres, and why don't I drop to the sort of the bottom three lines on that and get those out of the way. As I think I mentioned earlier before, music really was, there were music biographies for the most part, really well done music biographies. There was a nice slate of them there for a few years, and they pulled back from that. And I think it's probably more to do with their interest in continuity-driven series as opposed to anything wrong with music, the genre, or biography. Biography itself is still one of their strongest and most recognized brand franchises. So you see it zero itself out for 25 and 26. The same is true of documentaries. I think the documentaries were opportunistic in 2025, and they grabbed a couple of those. I don't off the top of my head recall what the titles were. I think one was on fentanyl, which is sort of just seems sort of random in their lineup. So I'm not surprised that they've kind of pulled back on that. And like I said, with food, that's a little bit of a legacy, and I might need to pull that off at some point just so I don't have a string of zeros running throughout. But again, we'll come back though to unscripted and crime, and what you'll pick up on is this healthy volume of crime, over 200 hours in 24 and again in 25. They're on pace for it in 26. They continue to have a really steady drumbeat of series overall, 15 already this year in the first half. Some of those are returning, some of those are first seasons. We'll talk about that in a second. And the same goes for unscripted. There is a very, very healthy volume. Like I said, the unscripted is largely the Wars franchise and the wrestling sort of franchise, but it's a steady performer in both of those instances.
Dan, question for you, Dan. Compared with Nat Geo and Discovery, each series seems to have a higher number, more than 10 episodes per title, whereas we were saying the numbers were less, I think 8 and 7, and for
yeah, I think it's a really important point, and I'm glad you picked up on it. And even going back further than what we've reflected on this chart in terms of volume of titles, going back for the full 5 years that I've been tracking them from 2022 on, they have been steady, probably the steadiest of all the networks that we keep an eye on, with roughly somewhere around 10 episodes per series on average. And it's a little bit, I will say it's a little bit wonky in some instances because I tried to, the spreadsheet that I keep is not as nuanced, counts hours and half hours sometimes in the same number of episodes volume, which is important. But there's such a heavy number of half hours that, in fact, with A&E, that 10 is probably slightly higher if I kind of went in and parsed it. But they've been very, very steady. And usually, again, one of the things that we talked about, I think, before with cost cutting, a lot of ways that, a network can cost cut in a couple of different ways, right? It can cut the volume of content, or it can cut the cost of content, or it can do both. And a lot of times when they're cutting the volume of content, they can wipe out entire volume of series, or they can maybe start to decrease the number of episodes in a series. If you go from 10 episodes to 8 episodes at, conservatively $300,000 a pop for some of these networks, you instantly save $500,000 to $750,000 multiplied by, 10 series on your channel. And, you've instantly got 5 to 10 million in savings, and you still feel like you've held intact, kind of your basic infrastructure. I think what A&E has done is held on to its volume, but try to be more efficient with the cost of that volume. So this sort of rise in the Wars franchise these last couple of years is really, I think, a pivot in that direction where, they're kind of consuming a great deal of real estate on their service, and yet the economics, I'm confident, are pretty efficient. So it's a great way to sort of hold serve while keeping your eye on your fiscal realities that are out there.
Yeah, and we have another chart that we're going to share when we round up the networks just before we go on, and that relates to distinguishes between renewed series from established producers who are getting the same work year after season versus newbies. Do you have any, just quick comments on that relative to the data that you're sharing here?
Yeah, thanks for raising that one too. That it's an element that we do like to talk about. I think, one of the things that I think is impressive again about A&E, I think we mentioned this even with, National Geographic is pretty good with this as well. And as well as Discovery, I think that's one of the key messages that all three networks we've profiled. There are opportunities for new ideas, for sure. A&E has debuted this year 26 new series, 25 series in a longer form, one limited series of 4 hours, but 26 new series out of the 27 projects. Only one is a special. And even that kind of falls almost into a quasi-series pilot. Of the 26, 10 of them are first seasons. And why I think it's important to talk about first seasons is first seasons represent something new and fresh, new idea. Now, maybe it's a spinoff, maybe it's a little derivative. It's okay, but it's new, okay? It's not the 14th renewal of X or the 12th renewal of Y or the third season of something else, which means that the network is still ingesting new concepts, new franchises, new directions. And that's important to hear that 10 out of 26 on A&E. That's about 40% of their stuff is brand new. So if you're a producer and you're knocking on A&E's door, it tells me that the door is open for at least new ideas. Now, are they open for new producers? Is a sort of the secondary part of that question, right? The
Yep.
answer is, like most of these established networks, not as much as maybe they'd like to be, and certainly it's never going to be easy. But as I was thinking about it for some other things that we're working on, Peter, it's like, when has it ever been easy? For
Exactly.
producers, we talk about how tough it is right now, but my goodness, we could go back to before either of us had gray hair, and we probably were saying it wasn't easy then either. So, you got to work for it. You got to make the right pitch. But with that said, 3 of those 10 series are from new producers that, as best I can tell, have not worked with A&E in the past. They got one of the, I think it was Desert Law, which is sort of implied as to what it is in the title. Pretty easy sort of organic fit that came from a company called 2020 Productions. There was a reboot of National Geographic's Alaska State Troopers after sort of being gone for a long, long time. Came from a company that I wasn't familiar with, Anusia, if I pronounced it right, ANUSIA, I think. And another company, Grinning Dogs, did a pilot last year for Squatters, which again, it fits into that wars sort of unscripted, economically efficient grouping. And they did a pilot. A&E must have liked what they saw. And all of a sudden this year, it showed up on their regular Tuesday night lineup with, I think the order is double digits at least,
And that's
from
really
what I've seen
interesting.
thus far. So there are new opportunities for both producers and ideas floating around if you want to go get them.
Dan, let's look at our takeaways. We're starting to run out of time a bit. You've got 5 big takeaways here looking at A&E.
Yeah, I think we've touched on most of these throughout, but just to reinforce it, their content is fully commissioned. Okay. It's their franchises are such that they use them both on their air and in some of their subsequent VOD offerings and other places. We'll talk about that in the last bullet point. Acquisitions, again, kind of gone extinct. I don't know how much they were ever there, to be honest, but certainly relative to the last 2 discussions that we had, where Discovery was dipping its toe and open in strategic moments, and Nat Geo has really sort of made a very strong and well-intentioned pivot into it successfully, I might add. A&E hasn't gone that route. When we talk about history, I think on our next one might be next up for us. We might see a couple of ones dotting the landscape in history, but A&E has yet to go there. Yeah, 3rd bullet point: crime. It's a workhorse. It's a workhorse for A&E for sure. First 48. Gosh, I can't remember the last time I looked at the episode count. I think the last time I looked at it was over 350 episodes in 15 plus years of existence. Is just, the gift that keeps on giving for what they do. They've got a number of these things that they continue to sort of work through in their schedule, and you see a pretty heavy, as we saw, over 200 hours of crime coming in. That's not all first 48. There's a lot of other franchises that are floating through there,
and a lot of Prodcos.
Yeah, and like I said, we sort of hinted at it with the 10 new series and the 3 new production companies. But actually, the other thing that we didn't really talk about in the other networks that we've covered thus far, but I was looking at it here for some reason. A&E, out of 27 titles, 27 new projects, 17 different production companies. So it's not like they've kind of got 2 favorites and the overwhelming majority of them the content. When we talk about ID at some point, you'll see a handful of production companies with 6, 8 projects at a time. The closest I came with A&E on that actually is inside their own family. A&E does a lot of work through its own internal studio called A&E Factual Studios, and also Category 6. I think 5 of the 27 titles are coming from in-house. Um, keep that machine running and their costs down is that in-house production.
The last
And it
bullet,
does well.
last bullet is really an interesting one, and then we'll have to finish up.
Yeah. And Peter, you and I have talked about this one quite a bit, haven't we, over the years, really? As we mentioned before, A&E does not have, its version of Discovery Plus or Disney Plus, Paramount Plus. So when they're done with their show on their linear service, it will migrate over to, their digital VOD offerings on their website. If you're getting your service through cable, like still, a good 50 plus million people do.
Or they'll sell it.
You'll see, cable, A&E on demand, and there it is, First 48 and Storage Wars and Late Night Law and, Neighborhood and all of these other things. So there's a sort of a normal thing, but they do not have the traditional streaming service. What that means is, though, is that down the road, not immediately, they're not doing it next day, but they're building up this library and effectively acting as a seller in addition to a buyer. I was looking into it quickly. They've got their brands on just about every major streaming service. If you're a Netflix viewer, all of a sudden I'm getting emails from Netflix telling me about these brand new documentaries. And I'm going, that's familiar to me. Well, of course it is. That's from the A&E and History library. And I watched them on A&E and History. So they're new to Netflix. Netflix is marketing them as new, even though they're 2 to probably 5 years old in some of these instances. First 48, the sort of the major franchise that we've mentioned, I was looking it up. You can find First 48 now on, and not the whole library. You'll find a little bit of seasons here and there throughout. Netflix, HBO Max, Hulu, Amazon, Peacock, Roku, Pluto, and I probably have missed any number of them. My guess is if you're running a streaming service, you picked up some A&E content. It's
I lost you, Dan.
comes back to the service. Yeah, sorry, Peter. I think you said you lost me there for a sec?
Yeah, I thought I lost you for a second. But Dan, it's time to wrap anyway. But I mean, this is really fascinating. What we have found, as I said at the head of our discussion, is that for all the focus on digital, for all the focus on the streaming platforms, that the legacy networks are still ordering original programs in significant numbers. We didn't get into budgets in this conversation because they are definitely lower than Discovery, on average, Discovery and Nat Geo, or that's our guesstimate, but it still amounts to a very substantial marketplace. So needs to be tracked. And next week, Dan, you're going to take us, or early July, you're going to take us over to history, and we'll see how A&E's sister or brother network is managing the programming challenge right now.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one. On a personal note, I'm a history buff, so it's a network that I enjoy professionally, but I also enjoy it personally. I do watch all the networks we've talked about in bits and pieces, but I'd say history is kind of one that I lean into heavily with, and I'll tease a little bit on their behalf. I've recorded it, but I have yet to find the time to dip into it. But the World War II series from Utopia with Tom Hanks, I'm really looking forward to checking that out. So I'll have to take a look at that one in preparation for our conversation next time.
Well, as an Aussie, I hope they have a full episode on Gallipoli and another one on the Kokoda. No Gallipoli for the Second World War, for the Kokoda Trail battle. Anyway, we'll talk about that next week. Dan, great to see you, and thanks for sharing your, original and, really you love the market, and your affection shows into the knowledge that you share with us, and it's useful for strategy also. So thank you so much, Dan.
Hey, thanks, Peter. I always love our conversations.